Hi there, it's Miss Tiffany from the Butler Area Public Library, and I'm here with another Library 101 video. Library 101 is a series to help you learn more about the Butler Area Public Library, about library services in general, and about information literacy. In a previous Library 101 video, we talked about basic story elements, things like the character, which is who is involved in the story, the setting, which is where the story takes place, and the plot, which is what happens in the story and how. In today's video, we're going to take a more detailed look at the plot of a story and what the narrative structure is when we're talking about a plot. So this diagram represents the plot of a story, and you'll notice it's broken into three sections. That is because there are three sections to every story. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end. Beginning, middle, end. So you see that the drawing on this really covers all three sections of the story, but different things happen at different points in all three sections. And by plotting the points of those different things, we get a diagram that looks like this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what each section represents and the points where the direction of the diagram changes. So of course, we're going to start at the very beginning. A very good place to start, right? The first thing that happens in the beginning of the story is something we call the exposition. In the exposition, you're really setting the scene of the story. You're building up the story world, you're describing the setting, you're introducing characters. Basically, if a story was a house, the exposition would be the foundation. However, you notice that at some point, that straight line of exposition, that foundation, hits a point where it starts to tilt upwards. That upward tilt is where we introduce the conflict in the plot. Remember, in every good story, there's a problem and a resolution. Another word for problem is conflict. The conflict in the story needs to be introduced somewhat in the beginning because you really want to hook the reader in, but you can't just let it stop there. And you can't just let it level off. You can't just introduce the conflict and then continue on in a straight line. You see that the line continues upward into the middle of the story. And that's where things start to get interesting. So now in the middle of the story, we continue trending upward with something called the rising action. The rising action is what keeps the story from leveling off after you introduce the conflict. You can't just tell about the conflict and then leave it at that. You have to have rising action to continue driving the story forward. So this is in pursuit of the resolution to the problem. As we progress further in the middle section of a story, the rising action is going to reach a point where it just can't get any higher. Things will get very tense and very fraught. And this is what we call the climax of the story. The stakes are as high as they're ever going to be. Things are never going to get more complicated. This is where the rubber really hits the road with your story. This is the all-time important moment in the story. We mentioned that the climax comes in towards the end of the middle section. Then, as we move into the ending of the story, remember the climax is as high as you can get. So after that, we see the diagram starts to trend downward, and this is the falling action. There's still enough action to propel the story forward, but we can tell that things are coming to an end. Things are not nearly as fraught. Things aren't moving at such a frantic pace. So we know that the most important moment has happened, and now we're continuing to move forward, but we also have falling action. Eventually, that falling action carries us through to the end of the book where we meet that point where the story levels out again and we have the resolution to the problem. So remember, every good story has a problem and a solution, and that resolution is where we find the ultimate solution and sort of get that happily ever after moment. One thing to note about a story diagram is the rising action doesn't always happen in one straight line like this. Think of it like a roller coaster. How boring would a roller coaster be if you just went straight and then up and then back down and it was over, right? Some people might like a roller coaster like that, but other people might want a little bit more action. The same thing happens in stories. Sometimes the rising action goes up and then drops down a little bit and then continues going up and drops down a little bit. So there might be several smaller peaks on the way up to the climax at the very top. So let's take a look at this diagram with a specific story in mind. Let's think about the story of the three little pigs. The exposition is the very beginning of the story. That's where we meet the three little pigs and we learn that they are building houses. This is where the action starts to rise. So we have the first pig built their house out of straw and the wolf blows it down. And then the next pig built his house out of sticks and the wolf blows it down. And then the third pig builds his house out of bricks and the wolf tries to blow it down and he can't. Now, the story doesn't end there, right? There's more to the story because the wolf doesn't give up. So the wolf keeps trying to get at those pigs until eventually he does the most outlandish, action packed thing he can think of. He climbs to the top of that brick house and he's going to jump down the chimney. That action is the climax of the story. As soon as he jumps down the chimney, the action begins to fall because we're almost at the end of the story. In that falling action, in the three little pigs, the wolf falls into a boiling pot over the fire that sits at the base of the chimney, right? So we know that our problem is almost ready to be solved. And once that action falls all the way down, the resolution is that the big bad wolf is no more, the pigs are safe and happy as they live on happily ever after in their home. So that's an example of what a story diagram looks like, the different parts of the story, where they fall in the beginning, the middle, and the end, and how to apply those different parts of the plot to a story that you all know very well. I've created a handout to go along with this video, and you'll find it at the link that I'm including in the video description. You can also find my contact information in the video description in case you have any questions about anything or would like to suggest a future topic for a Library 101 video. Thank you so much for watching and happy reading.